and it is certainly my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome our panelists to this very exciting panel on the TPNW. Let me just say a few words before introducing the panel that we have seen over the past 8 days so far a number of very engaging speakers, high-level speakers, and prominent analysts in the field of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. We've seen several very exciting panels, and I consider this one to be at least on the top of my list of interesting panels, not only because of the importance of the TPNW, but also because we have three amazing women that have devote their life to the issue of nuclear disarmament. And so I'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to be our panelist. And I would also particularly like to thank Nomsa Ndongwe for agreeing to jump in as a panelist at last minute. Our other invited panelist, Pablo Inikin, who is a former CNS visiting fellow, could at the last minute not join us. So if Pablo is listening, Pablo, we miss you and we wish you well. So let me introduce the panelists briefly. As you know, all the bios are available on the course platform. And firstly, I don't think Paola needs any introduction. She has been a magnificent co-host of this course, and as the Deputy Director General for Disarmament, Non-proliferation, and Arms Control in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, she is a leading force in the field. I would like to introduce, if you do not know her, you may perhaps been living on a different planet, but introduce Beatrice Fihn, who is the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize Laureate. She accepted that prize on behalf of ICAN in Oslo and has led the campaign since 2013 and has tirelessly worked to mobilize civil society through the development of the TPNW. She has many years of experience in diplomacy, worked with ICAN, worked with the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, and she is from Sweden and has a master's degree in law from the University of London. I have been fortunate enough to have met Beatrice many times. Beatrice, so good to see you again. And then let me introduce very briefly also Nomsa Ndongwe, who works very closely with me. Nomsa is a candidate of the master's degree in non-proliferation terrorism studies here at the Middlebury Institute. Nomsa is a former Zimbabwean diplomat and served at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. She has a law background. In addition to her non-proliferation background, she has traveled and lived abroad extensively. And just most recently, she co-founded and now directs the West Coast chapter of the Women in Nomsa. You could perhaps help me with the acronym, but for women in the field of non-proliferation security, but particularly women of color in the field, which is a very, very important initiative taken by Nomsa and other colleagues. So with that, I am going to ask the panel to start their presentations in the order published. So we'll start with Paola, to be followed by Beatrice, and then Nomsa, without further introduction between them, and then we will have our question and answer session following that. So Paola, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jan. Just please allow me to say hello to my fellow colleagues and dear friends, both of them. So just without any more time taken on that, I will just say a couple of general aspects that I want to mention before going to the main topic to bear in mind while I'm presenting. So first of all, I will speak in my personal capacity But of course, I will take advantage of my experience as a national delegate from Mexico during 6 years in Geneva, during the main part of the process that actually ended in the adoption of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, TPNW. I will refer to it during the rest of our presentation. Also, I mean, the perspective that I will provide is actually going to be from the state. It's going to be state perspective based. So, of course, that might be complemented with what Beatrice might say on civil society perspective and how we start interacting and having a pretty dynamic relationship during the last decade, which actually ended up with the result of the TPNW. The second thing is that I will present in a way that I will talk fora by fora what was happening, what's the context that actually we were living before achieving the TPNW. So you actually can see that this is not just out of what they say, only frustration or this kind of simple explanations about how we got to the treaty, but actually I will mention fact-based and I will mention why we decided to take action when it was obvious that no advances were gonna take place in the traditional forest. And of course, even if I will focus on the last 10 years, just to mention that, of course, before those 10 years, there were other contributions and other discussions around the possibility of a prohibition of nuclear weapons, but not to diminish their contribution to the actual goal of achieving the treaty. And please, just participants, if you have a piece of paper and a pen, I will invite you to write down. I will mention a lot of documents and resolutions, which I will not have the time to explain in detail, but I invite you to later on actually go and consult them, because that will give you other details that might contribute to the understanding of the whole process. So, well, here we go. I will start with a treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. As we know, we already have a class on that. It entered into force in 1970. And we had, of course, 4 main review conference, which we have to mention, of course, already 1995, when we achieved the extension, the extension of the treaty, indefinite extension, where we have this package of decisions, which we already talked about, that are still valid, and until they are fulfilled, they are still valid. Then we have the 2000 review conference, where we also have a good result, when we have the 13 practical steps towards nuclear disarmament. Also, please go and read it, so you can have an idea about all those elements that you need in order to strengthen and complete the existing non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament regime. And then, of course, the 2010 review conference, which ended up in the action plan, which specify actions for each of the 3 pillars of the treaty. This is really important because from 2010 to the review conference of 2015, there was a high expectations of parties towards implementation of these action plans. Unfortunately, actions that were focused on Pillar 1 were not implemented as such, or really few of them were. You can see a little bit of advancement, but really Pillar 1, there was a big delay, and there was a sense that there was not even interest from those parties, mainly nuclear weapon states, to comply with their commitments. So that's kind of the background and the expectation that it was going around 2015, which in the end ended up failing, not because of Pillar 1, but because of Pillar 2, which was actually related to getting an agreement or not, which was not reached on the nuclear weapons-free zone on the Middle East. So just for you to have that into mind. So that was, let's say, the scenario that we were living in the NPT. Then we have, you have to take into account that we have the conference in disarmament in in Geneva, which hasn't reached any kind of agreement or hasn't give any kind of contribution to nuclear disarmament, at least since 1996. And not even that, it hasn't even been able to adopt a program of work since 1998. So, I mean, there was there was a frustration there, yes. There was a frustration that the only fora that was actually mandated to negotiate on these aspects, these and other aspects of disarmament, but let's focus on nuclear disarmament, has not reached any kind of progress, but has not even reached a program of work. So it was not envisaged that we were gonna get anywhere there, even though we tried to do our best to try to move forward. But just for you to take that into account, the fora was totally uneasy until now, totally in a deadlock. And I don't think that there are high expectations of breaking that deadlock anytime soon. Then we'll move at this same period, let's say, we had 3 conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So we have one in Oslo in 2013, one in Mexico in 2014 in Nayarit, and the last one also in 2014 in Vienna. So this kind of conferences, what they actually achieved was to give a fact-based information on scientific grounds about which are the humanitarian consequences of a possible detonation of a nuclear weapon, either if it was accidental or intentional. It was like, what's going to happen and who is going to get affected by it. The main conclusion is that, of course, the impact of these kind of detonations, in Oslo, we focus on the short-term impact. Nayarit, it was more in a long-term impact, and it actually also established that there was also an impact, that it was not time-bounded. And of course, also in Vienna, we had we went further and focused a little bit more on the risk of the existence of nuclear weapons and what was exactly it. I think one of the main conclusions that the 3 conferences stressed was that there is no state or international body that could address immediate humanitarian emergency caused by a nuclear weapon detonation in any meaningful way, and that no existing national or international emergency system will be able to provide adequate assistance to the victims. So this is something that you have to take into account. This is something that create a lot of awareness in the membership in terms also of start changing. It helps a lot in changing the narrative and discourse towards the protection of the humanity as such, and the need to eliminate nuclear weapons. As we mentioned, the only, well, it has all been recognized, is that the only way to actually eliminate the risk posed by nuclear weapons is by its total elimination. So that's something that you have to keep also in mind. One aspect that we have to also pick from this conference was that during the Vienna conference, Austria, in its national capacity, made a pledge, announced that it was in the beginning called the Austrian Pledge, and later on was joined by 127 states, and then was renamed as the Humanitarian Pledge. And it will actually, in a way, create the humanitarian initiative, but will actually consolidate it, because it was actually, it started before, but it was consolidated with this humanitarian pledge. So what was this pledge about? It has 4 main aspects. One aspect was to present the fact-based discussions, findings, and compelling evidence of the Vienna conference, which builds upon the previous conference in Oslo and Nayarit, to all relevant fora. That means the NPT, the CD, any fora on disarmament. We were actually, we committed to bring all these findings and say, this is what's gonna actually base and underpin all of our efforts towards nuclear disarmament. The second aspect is to follow the imperative of human security for all, and to promote the protection of civilians against risks stemming from nuclear weapons. Third, calls on all states party to the NPT to renew their commitments to the urgent and full implementation of existing obligations under Article 6 of the NPT. And finally, to take concrete interim measures to reduce the risk of nuclear weapon detonations. So those were the main aspects. You can read it all in the humanitarian pledge, but those were the main aspects that we took from there. Then this humanitarian initiative, as I mentioned, was consolidated with the humanitarian pledge, but it actually it started in a way to have a presence in fora since 2011. With two main background elements. One will be that during the 2010 review conference, in the final document, there was a reference to the deep concern and catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And the other relevant element will be, of course, in 2010, 2011, ICRC and the Red Cross movement appealed to states to urgently prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons in legally binding international agreement. So those aspects actually help to start, making states and delegates to start moving and try to see in which way we could contribute towards this end. So the first time that it was that this humanitarian initiative was seen was with what we maybe in a small group called the G16, which was the first statement that was delivered in an NPT preparatory committee in 2011 in Vienna, which actually focused on these humanitarian consequences and says that every single effort is underpinned by these humanitarian consequences. So these will be the main elements, but this came from being 16 countries in the preparatory, in the PrepCon, sorry, in 2012, sorry, not 2011, but 2012 in Vienna. Later on, we have, we presented another statement with 35 countries in the first committee, the 67 UNGA. And then we move again to the second preparatory committee for the 2015 review conference in Geneva, presenting this with the support of 80 countries. After this first preparatory committee, we move again to the first committee. So that will be the 68 UNGA first committee in New York. That's in 2014. And that one, we have a support of 125 countries. Then we move again to the NPT. So it was NPT first committee, because that's the way the calendar works in disarmament. So from this first committee, we move again to the review conference. And that one will be with the support of 155, sorry, with the first, in the last preparatory committee with 155. And then we ended up with the support of 159 countries. So it comes from 16 countries to the support of 159 countries in the end, let's say, of the cycle, presenting this as the main element that we have to take into account through the narrative of nuclear disarmament, changing the usual narrative and discourse that was actually, in a way, in the middle of all the nuclear disarmament discussions for many decades supported. So I think this is something that we have to bear in mind. Since, I mean, in all this process, I have to say that we were, all of these 159 countries, we were all together in supporting of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons as the core of the discussions, but we were not all of us agreeing on how to achieve nuclear disarmament. We have different approaches toward nuclear disarmament, and that's gonna be something that we have to work with if we wanted to achieve a final result. Actually, and I have to be honest on this, all this time we knew we had to do something, but the what and the how was not clear. It was all coming through working and having discussion among ourselves and member states and civil society to see exactly what we could do and in which way we could contribute to the regime. I think that I can remember that the first really, let's say, serious meeting with between some of like-minded countries that we were really committed to move forward and try to find ways just to move forward and nuclear disarmament negotiations, and civil society. I remember the first time I participated in 2013 in a small meeting somewhere in Lyon, and actually it was civil society the ones who told us you have to do something and to consider that nuclear weapon states might not be there. But if you wait for them to do something, keep waiting, and get comfortable. So there was a strong call for us to get out of that comfort zone and try to do something. And that was a call from civil society that at that time was assessed, and we were a little bit hesitant and say we have to assess and see in which way we could actually contribute and work with each other. But it was learning from zero and developing the relationship and developing the narrative from, I will say, 2013 until 2017, even if before there were other kind of discussions or everything. But I think the first serious one and the first time that it was a shocking part of get out of your comfort zone was in 2013. So let's move to the other aspect that I mentioned, another forum, which is the main forum in which nuclear disarmament, actually peace and international security is being dealt with, is the General Assembly in its first committee. Here, there was a failed attempt from, it will say, Mexico, Austria, Norway in 2011 to, in a way, move, to present a resolution that was, in a way, against the CD. It was directly against the CD and the stalemate. And while trying to present this resolution, we saw that there was a big pushback from countries. Do not touch the CD. That was it. It was like, do whatever you want, but do not touch the CD. Okay, so the resolution was actually not tabled. It was just a draft resolution. It was discussed and everything, but it was really important for us to recalibrate and to say, okay, we have to rethink in the way that we want to move forward and in which way we could actually do so. And so the first thing that we have to do is, which is our objective? Our objective is not the CD or not the CD. The objective is to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiation. That's the objective. We need to move forward. So in 2012, at the 77 UNGA, resolution 67/56 for you to look up, it was the time that this resolution decides to establish an open-ended working group to develop proposals to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations for the achievement and maintenance of a world without nuclear weapons. So the objective was just to open the fora for deliberation to see in which way we can actually make some progress. We try not to touch upon the CD, even we requested that the report has to be delivered to the CD for its study. And of course, we still have some pushback because some countries were hesitant that the purpose of this resolution was actually to harm the CD, but we were really clear and say, look, what we want is that we have to stop focusing on the fora, but we do have to focus on the objective itself. So please help us contribute to the discussions. We are not going to negotiate, we're not harming, we're not going against the mandate of the CD. We're actually using the mandate of the GA to have some deliberation on this. And that's what we did. We have also pushed back for this negotiation because we were opening the participation of civil society. And that was a big pushback. I have to say one of the biggest one. And once we finally achieve its adoption, I have to say that the three experts, it was from Austria, Norway, and myself, we have a big pushback even inside the UN in Geneva for actually setting up the open-ended working group. So it was not an easy piece. We already had the resolution. We had no help at all in the beginning from the Secretariat. They were really pushing back until our countries had to make some calls to, at that time, the High Representative Angela Kane and say, look, we're facing this. So she helped us and say, no, you have a resolution. We have, I mean, we're the Secretariat, we have to support. And then after that, we have the support to actually set the open-ended working group. What was good about the open-ended working group, that one, if you read, I mean, I will invite you, it might be basic, but if you read the report of this open-ended working group, it might say some pre-logical or elemental aspects, but it's really important because it changed the way that we delegates used to work in Geneva. It stopped being only monologues and stopped just reading our statements and everything. We actually interact. You can actually see that we have to ask for breaks, and you can see, you know, from one side, non-nuclear weapon states, and the other side, some umbrella countries, and trying to talk to each other and trying to find actual solutions or try to find agreements. That was the benefit of it. That's something that you cannot see in the report, but that's actually the contribution of this open-ended working group, the way that we changed the interaction among delegates. Also, of course, the contribution of civil society. It was the first time that they were part of it. And that one, I mean, in a better capacity just and reading a statement. And that was the first time that we kick this kind of interaction and say, look, we need other stakeholders at the table to change also the dynamics that we are used to negotiate in. From that, of course, well, we presented a report, we request some studies and say, okay, we have to wait for these cycles that we have in Disarmament, the calendar that, as I mentioned, is pretty set, and try to see if any of the fora is able or not to contribute to the advancements of negotiations on nuclear disarmament. We were actually waiting in a way for what's going to happen or not in the review conference in 2015, and we give a couple of chances to the existing forums to do something about it. So I will just present two of them. One was in 2015, actually in January. That was from a national perspective, and it was when Mexico took the presidency of the city. So we embarked into really serious consultations in order to see if we could break the stalemate and bring the negotiations back to the city with a program of work. The program of work, I mean, we really work on that one. We thought it could be the best shot, but we also were aware that if the program of work as such, as it was presented, was not accepted, there was no way that with any kind of tweaks or changes, it was going to be accepted. So we gave it a try, and unfortunately, it was blocked by Pakistan because of course, the FMCT. So, but I have to be honest, if it was not Pakistan, the first one to say and to put their names up, it might be other countries doing it. So just to mention that it was not the only one country that could actually block it, that to be fair on that aspect. After that, we had the 2015 review conference, and we see that there was not just that there was no willingness from nuclear weapon states to move forward, but actually what was evident is that they were trying to move backwards. And that they will say, oh, well, they were saying, okay, no, let's just roll over the 2010 action plan ad infinitum, and at some point we will actually fulfill the actions on nuclear disarmament. And of course, that was not acceptable. Okay, so we keep on negotiations. We had some language on Pillar 1 that was not the best one, I have to be honest. It was not the best one, but I don't think that somebody will actually maybe block it. So it was not Pillar 1 what actually broke the agreement on 2015, but it actually clarified the situation for non-nuclear weapon states that we were not counting with nuclear weapon states on advancing nuclear disarmament. So here is where we had to assess, and we actually also took a lot of, you know, you have here in the back civil society telling you, hey, there's another way, we have been telling you, and please look this way. And the discussion was about what could be done in order to contribute to the regime without the nuclear weapon states. So of course, elimination of nuclear weapons, and that you have to have it clear, because there's a lot of misinformation and kind of distraction arguments from nuclear weapon states and some countries under the umbrella that try to say, yes, we're not going to join, yes, no, this is not nuclear disarmament. We never tried to have an elimination treaty. That was not the goal. This was not the sole solution for nuclear disarmament. We never say so. We say the contribution that we could that we could actually give to the regime is to create the prohibition, and that's it. It's the prohibition as such has two main. I mean, really in a simple way to say it, has two main aspects. Before getting to global zero, it will actually contribute, and it does. It actually, you can see it until now. It does contribute toward the stigmatization of the existence of nuclear weapons. It creates higher costs for those who have nuclear weapons to actually keep them. So that's in a way, its main contribution towards achieving global zero. But actually, in the full regime of non-proliferation and disarmament, it has another really strong contribution, which is that once we achieve global zero, you must have a prohibition, because it's the only way that you can actually grant irreversibility of nuclear disarmament. So we contribute before and after the achieving of global zero to the regime. That's the point of it. Okay, so we are not in a way expecting that this treaty will achieve elimination of nuclear weapons. No. I'm clear about it. That's not the goal. And we're not receiving that as a criticism, because we actually say it ourselves. This is just a contribution to strengthen and complement the regime. So just to have that clarity. Also, just I will just go to this treaty in a really general manner, because I took a lot of time, but I invite you to see one thing here, and it's a preamble. And the preamble of the treaty will actually focus on the objectives and principles of the treaty. Any criticism towards the TPNW that is related to going against the NPT or any other aspect of the regime is actually answering the preamble. So I just invite you to, of course, read the whole treaty, but concentrate on the preamble, which actually is outlining the objectives and principles of this treaty. I will leave it there in order to give a chance to my fellow friends to actually contribute to this panel. And if you have any questions, please start posting them so we can actually take them later on. Thank you, Jan. So I think, Bea, you go ahead after me. It's perfect.
Beatrice, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's really, really nice to be here. I'm very glad that you guys are doing this conference or this course, even though travel is not possible. But I also feel a bit sorry, because going to Mexico for this course is always a big highlight and a lot of fun. And thank you so much to Paola for outlining that. I kind of took a lot of notes and crossed off things. You mentioned a lot of things that was part that, you know, that I was going to mention, but I also think that it's really important to have these different perspectives. And, you know, my perspective on this comes from civil society, of course, which is a slightly different one. But I wanted to start by outlining a little bit of the reasoning behind this treaty. I mean, I think that it's important to remind ourselves that nuclear weapons really continue to be one of the most serious threats to this world, to international peace and security. And they are really the most destructive and inhumane and indiscriminate weapon that has ever been created, both in terms of the scale of the devastation they cause and in their sort of unique, persistent and dangerous of this spreading of radioactive fallout. They are really unlike any other weapon that exists. And a single nuclear bomb detonated over a large city could kill millions of people. And the use of tens or hundreds of nuclear bombs could disrupt the global climate, causing widespread famine across the world. So the impact of these weapons would really be devastating and actually would violate the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions. We have committed to protecting civilians in warfare, and nuclear weapons are really the opposite of that. These are weapons of mass murder. These are weapons meant to wipe out whole civilian populations. This is not a precision guidance weapon meant to take out a very narrow military target. This is to wipe out schools, hospitals, populated areas, a whole city. And it really is essential for the protection of populations that governments make sure that the weapons with such inhumane consequences do not remain legal, and that they are not potential options for states in warfare. So for us, just doing the thinking on this weapon, what do we do with weapons that cause indiscriminate harm to civilians? And in particular, I'm thinking of what we've done to other weapons like that. Biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, blinding lasers, for example. We ban them. And it's quite remarkable to think actually that we, for very long, kind of forgot to do that globally when it comes to nuclear weapons. Because most governments, almost all governments in the world have committed to the kind of goal of eliminating nuclear weapons through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But really, it's the only weapon where we've tried to eliminate nuclear weapons while also keeping it legal. It is the complete opposite to every other weapon in the world. And it kind of started this thinking that nuclear weapons are somehow separate from logic and sanity and reason. It applies different rules. It's like an exception under in the way that we think. So really looking at this weapon as a weapon, as another weapon that, you know, in the same way as we looked at chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, it was really the straightforward thinking around the idea that we could actually just ban them as a starting point. That was the whole start of this initiative. And it really, you know, Paola's outlined kind of some of the formal steps that was taken. We had, you know, for us, you know, obviously the NPT review conference in 2010 was a really key moment where governments equitized the catastrophic humanitarian consequences. But really the first kind of concrete step towards that was the first conference on the humanitarian consequences that were held in Oslo in 2013. And even for me, you know, being very committed to this cause, I think that it was at that conference that it kind of clicked for me personally, how this would work and why this would have an impact even if the nuclear armed states was not on board. And it was actually the day before the conference started when we had a big civil society meeting, about 500 activists gathered in Oslo to kind of talk about nuclear weapons, how we're going to get a treaty banning them, and no government was like on board with this plan at this point. And we had a representative from the Norwegian government speaking at the civil society event, Gry Larsen. She was the state secretary. And just a couple of days before, the P5 had demarched the Norwegian government and announced that they would not participate in this Oslo conference. It was a setup, you know, kind of right in a way. But when she spoke about this, and she's like, well, you know, the P5 came to see us and they were not very happy with this conference. And, you know, they gave their arguments for why they weren't going to participate and referred that the conference on disarmament is really the only place where things are happening. And she said something, you know, just made a joke and said, you know, the arguments weren't very convincing. And these 500 people in the audience were laughing. And for me, just kind of looking around in this room, and it was like the first time we laughed at the P5. And kind of sort of shrug our shoulders, let's keep going without them. Because we had been really nervous up to that point, thinking that, oh, if they don't come to this meeting, maybe it's all for nothing, maybe nobody will come, maybe they will all feel like a failure if they don't show up. And for me, it really clicked like there is power in the narrative. And there's power in who's moving forward and who's standing still. And that in itself is a powerful sort of shift in the power dynamics around this issue. So for me, really, it kind of clicked at that moment that, this is really something we could do even without the participation of the nuclear armed states. And of course, after that, we went to Mexico for the second conference on the humanitarian impact in February 2014, where we had almost 150 governments there participating, and a really strong presentations and a very strong kind of outcome document or a statement from the Mexican foreign minister, who I think spoke for everyone when he said that this is a point of no return. Like there was a feeling that something is happening here. We're not quite sure what it is. From ICAN's side, we always know where we wanted it to go. We wanted it to go to a treaty banning nuclear weapons, but we weren't sure if we were going to get that. And we didn't really know if governments would be on board with that. But there was also this kind of excitement about, you know, could we do something? Could something new happen? Could we break out of these kind of depressing conversations in the Conference on Disarmament where nothing happens, or this very sort of procedural focus in the NPT? Oh, is it going to be an outcome document or not? And like, let's do something, and let's do something that's a little bit new and energetic. And of course, then went through to the Vienna conference in December 2014. And all of these conferences were really unique in terms of being very focused on expert presentations. It looked mainly at the consequences and the risk and also the sort of legal structure, but it wasn't really a conference about solutions. That came afterwards when we talked about the kind of options for moving forward through the open-ended working group. I think a parallel to these three conferences was also seeing the kind of growing recognition of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons through joint statements at the NPT that got up to 159 states supporting a statement expressing concerns of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences. And this is really important. This is not just a random statement at the UN. This is really to kind of change the narrative around nuclear weapons, talking about the human impact, talking about the survivors and their stories from nuclear test sites and the use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and really kind of hammer home that it's in the interest of the very survival of humanity that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. So actually 159 states signed on, including several NATO states, signed on to this statement saying, under no circumstances is it okay to use nuclear weapons. So I think that was really kind of a moment of really excitement. And it's really funny to look back now and like thinking about what happened in 2015. So much has happened in the world since then. And I can almost look back, oh, wasn't that a cute time? It feels, you know, since this last, you know, since 2014, basically, with, you know, starting with Russian invasion of Ukraine, you know, things have shifted very drastically. So obviously this process started in a different context where a lot of kind of energy and positivity. But obviously, as Paola talked about, these conferences and the NPT in 2015 led to an open-ended working group where governments were discussing different ways forward. That open-ended working group kind of concluded through a vote that their recommendation was a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, which then the General Assembly went on to formally launch those negotiations. And the treaty negotiations took place in 2017 in New York at the United Nations. And it was a really quite a fascinating process. Now, obviously, 3 years later, we just celebrated the third anniversary of the adoption of the treaty last week. It feels very, you know, my memories are maybe a little bit sort of rosy at this point. I said, it was a great time. It was really fun to negotiate. That wasn't so hard. And I remember there's a lot of anxiety and difficulties and challenges, but it was also one of those really unique moments where you felt like all the governments, because they had this kind of natural self-selection, the governments that like nuclear weapons, they want to keep nuclear weapons, they stayed out and they protested. They held a protest press conference outside the negotiating room. I remember the US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, rallied a group of nuclear-armed and nuclear-allied states to stand outside and protest the negotiations. And it was quite a bizarre feeling for ICAN, you know, being, you know, civil society being on the inside negotiating, and the P5 on the outside protesting. It was kind of like very reversed roles suddenly. But it was really unique because the governments that were part of that process and were in the room wanted to ban nuclear weapons. And we were all on the same side. And I think that created quite a lot of unique trust in delegations. We disagreed wildly on things, but never the purpose. And I think that in particular for nuclear weapons, comparing to the NPT, for example, or comparing to the conversations in the Conference on Disarmament, having a group of governments being in the same room and everyone having quite a lot of faith that, you know, these governments here want to do this. and you know, we might disagree on certain provisions, but it doesn't come from like an attempt to sabotage. It really comes from an attempt to make it work for your national purposes. And I think that that created a very unique atmosphere. So there's really three things that I found kind of like that kind of process was really, really inspiring and really positive in a way. The other thing that I find has been really unique about this whole process was also the very close relationship and cooperation between governments, international organizations, and civil society. And having sort of first a core group of governments that we worked, for example, in ICAN very closely with and continue to work very closely with, recognizing that we have very different roles and very different approaches. And I was just looking at the attendance list here, and I see several names of people who probably have been on the receiving end of a lot of nagging from ICAN and our campaigners. Is what we do. You know, our goal is to push governments, and Paola talked a little bit about that as well, and to sort of ask for more, and like, it's not good enough, and more. But I think that we've had a really positive collaboration with most governments. And you know, involving organizations, United Nations, of course, academia, experts, the Red Cross movement, for example, both on a national and international level. So that has been extremely positive. And it was something that we learned from the processes banning landmines and banning cluster munitions. And that is something that has been missing before in the nuclear weapons negotiations, I think, this kind of very active involvement of civil society. And I think that the negotiations really benefited positively from that. The second really unique aspect of this whole process has been the focus on non-nuclear weapon states, and in particular countries from the global south. In particular because nuclear weapons is seen as such a North American, European dominated kind of field. You have the P5, you have some other nuclear armed states, and the rest of the world is discounted as irrelevant. And I'm sure a lot of diplomats can also feel like that in these negotiating settings, that, you know, what the white European countries say matters a lot, and what all those African countries or Latin American countries or Asian countries, it doesn't really matter. And one of the things that we worked really hard on was to talk about the impact. When there's nuclear war, and if we don't solve this issue, there will eventually be a nuclear war again. This is going to harm all of us, and it's going to harm people far away from Washington and Moscow and things like that. And tomorrow is actually the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear test, the Trinity test. And you know, it also sort of like brings home, and what we try to talk about when we talk about the impact is not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the huge amount of devastating impacts and consequences of the nuclear test sites. These 9 nuclear armed states have done over 2,000 tests in over 60 locations. And many of these locations were in former colonies or on indigenous community land, and really were used as guinea pigs by these governments. And the idea that these 9 leaders, and in particular when you think about the leaders today, Trump, Putin, Kim Jong-un, Boris Johnson, and these kind of people have the ability to end all of us, every single country on this world. And what they do might completely wipe out your whole populations. And what we try to do is really kind of change the perspective that this is not just an issue where the rest of the world sits silently and listen to them talking and wish that they could come out with something. This is really the obligation of all countries to take a center stage on this field and to really have a voice. And that was something that was really, really fantastic throughout the negotiations and this whole process, the kind of emergence of new leadership on this issue. And of course, when it comes to Latin America and Caribbean, has, you know, been a leader on this for many times, especially through the Tlatelolco Treaty and its historic opposition to nuclear weapons. It's been very strong, been strong advocates. But throughout this process, the Latin American and Caribbean region really emerged as a leader on the issue. And I think that banning nuclear weapons really reflects kind of a new focus, a very needed focus on security policy, where humanitarian concerns and the concerns of people and humanitarian law takes a much more central role. And the problems that have these very wide global impacts means that stakeholders from all regions of the world not just the permanent members of the Security Council, have to have a voice and a role in the solutions. So, of course, when the TPNW opened for signature in September 2017, it was great to see that Latin American and Caribbean countries really continued to lead the way by being a driving force in signing it. And actually today, and if you see me looking at my phone, it's because we're expecting a ratification any second right now to hit 40. I'm just trying to get it confirmed, the UN, waiting for them in New York. But when that happens, we will have 40 ratifications. And 17 of those are from that region, from Latin America and Caribbean. And it's really the region that's been leading the way. Additional 10 have signed and are in the process of ratifying. And there's just 5 countries in the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean that have not yet signed or ratify, and we're expecting to see most of those do so in the near future. So this is really moving forward thanks to this region. We're always overconfident and optimistic, but we're really believing there's a very strong chance that the treaty will enter in force or reach 50 this year in 2020. And we think that that's a really fitting moment as we are commemorating the 75th anniversary of not just the Trinity test, but also Hiroshima and Nagasaki this year. And we've also seen how we can use this treaty to rally public support, the very much needed public support to change the minds of the nuclear armed states. The humanitarian initiative and the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons have really become the most dynamic movement for engaging the public, for exploring new constituencies and new kind of actors in this field, and re-energizing civil society. And the treaty is really the positive development in this field, in a otherwise quite a bleak few years where we've seen a lot of setbacks. And I think that this is where the progress is. This is where the progress happens. And sometimes we get the criticism that, well, what's the point if the nuclear armed states are not on board? Is it really going to matter? And I think that progress is motivating in itself. And doing things is always better than not doing things. And I think in particular, you can see, for example, I mean, I'm a European, so I can be a little bit mean to these countries. If you look at the way that the European countries right now are handling the setbacks of INF treaty and JCPOA and all these kind of things that I'm sure you talked about already a lot, they're paralyzed. And they are not trying new things, they're just more standing still and losing energy, losing steam. And that's also extremely bad development. So I really think that we should be very grateful for the treaty and the prohibition on nuclear weapons. I'm very grateful for every single country that signs and ratifies, because these are very tough times. And despite an extremely concerning international development right now and an extremely insecure kind of security situation, so many countries are moving forward to completely prohibit this last weapon of mass destruction. I think that is, we shouldn't take that for granted. We could have seen reactions to the current security situation completely in the opposite direction, that all countries are now withdrawn from the NPT and want to develop nuclear weapons instead, but it's not happening. And I think that that's something to really value high and cherish. And the way that we see that this treaty, now that it's about to hopefully enter into force within the coming few months, is that history has really shown that the prohibition of certain weapons systems facilitates progress towards elimination. Weapons that are outlawed are increasingly seen as illegitimate, losing their political status, and along with it also the resources for their production, such as modernization and things like that. Arms companies, for example, finds it more difficult to acquire resources to work on illegal weapons. And it becomes more of a reputational risk, both for governments, companies, and everyone else supporting it. So really, by changing the way that the world perceives nuclear weapons, the TPNW really is having a meaningful impact, even beyond those states that formally signs and ratifies the treaty at the outset. And once it's enforced, which we hope will happen very soon, it challenges the notions that possessing nuclear weapons is legitimate for some states. So it has both normative and very practical impact on those both states that stands inside it and those outside it. And of course, we know that banning nuclear weapons is not the same thing as eliminating them. But I really do think that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is really the most significant change of the status quo of nuclear weapons that have happened for a very long time. And it can really become a catalyzer for progress on nuclear disarmament and arms control for the coming decades. And of course, the dismantlement of all nuclear arsenals will be a very long process. But a clear international rejection of these weapons is essential. It's not the end point, it's the starting point for the future disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. So I think I'll stop there and excited to talk more later.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. That was fascinating. So Nomsa, please, your turn. And I apologize for messing up your introduction. And I just wanted to also invite you to say a few words about your role, but also the importance in this context of the women of color for advancing peace and security. So thank you very much, Nomsa.
Beatrice and Paola for your very good presentations on why this is important. I'm going to share my screen. Please forgive me if it's not looking the way it should. I think it's looking good, right? We have a bottom line up front on the screen.
You're good to go.
Awesome. Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Nomsa Ndongwe, and I was a diplomat in Geneva for Zimbabwe, which is a non-aligned movement country, and it is obviously also a South country. Now, my trajectory to the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies is interesting because when I was posted to Geneva, I had experience as a diplomat, but I did not have experience in disarmament. So it was a very steep learning curve, and I got there hot off the trails of Mexico's dynamic CD presidency. So everybody was talking about it, and I was fortunate enough to basically sort of get up to speed in terms of why disarmament is important. Because if you are from a small country, like some of you are, you know that they like to, priorities in a mission, it's like, who has time for this? We don't have nuclear weapons, let's just keep it moving. Now, the most important thing for me was the fact that when I started, Paola was this dynamic individual, and I was just like, wow, she knows so much. And it was so interesting to be listening to her presentation today and being like, oh yes, now I know exactly what she's talking about. I know what all the acronyms mean. So that's a pretty interesting and learning curve in a 5-year period. And Beatrice, I had the pleasure of meeting her in Geneva during the negotiations of the open-ended working group, which basically birthed the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. So my bottom line up front is the treaty is an example of how you can leverage your influence on the international stage. And it is also an example, as they like to say in the streets, if you open up your purse and leverage your position, if you have the funds, if you have the means, do something that is going to basically help the whole world going forward. Now, I think if I had more time, I would have created a pop quiz section for all of you. And you're very lucky that I can't see all your faces, but I would have loved I think if you guys walk away, if everybody walks away with one thing, one resolution that you remember is resolution 7033, because that is the resolution that gave the mandate to establishing an open-ended working group. So very quickly, pop quiz. What day in December 2015 was that adopted? I'm kidding. Anyway, one of the most important parts of this resolution was the civil society element. And I think this is so important to stress, to say, if you are very new in the field, you're coming in at a time when civil society engagement is more dynamic, and it's taken for granted. But a short 5-6 years ago, it was basically unheard of to have civil society being so active in the disarmament umbrella specifically, which is why we have all these treaties that have been negotiated outside of the disarmament framework that we all know, and love. Now, we had 3 sessions in Geneva. The first was in February, and then May and August. February was, you know, like it was fine, you know, everyone was like getting together and people were still a little bit cheerful. Mexico had just finished their presidency in the CD. So everybody was a little bit like, oh, okay, just had a bit of caffeine boost. And then we had the first negotiating session, which went all right. It was, we got to meet civil society. We got to listen to what they were trying to say and have them sort of like give us the impetus. I must confess, I was one of the people that benefited from the ICAN and the civil society group approaching me and saying, hey, this is why we know you're a small mission. We know that you have like multiple portfolios, but please, please, please attend this meeting. And we also had the Paolas from Mexico, and we had South Africa, you know, also coming to say, hey, my sister from Zimbabwe, we need you in this fight. Your voice matters, your role matters. And I think it's quite interesting because between the first session of the open-ended working group and the second one, we had the NPT review conference shenanigans, sort of like having people, you know, distressed and not really wanting to go forward. And you had a lot of interventions by the nuclear weapon states saying it was a waste of time. And it's incredible when you think about when someone is in power and they tell you that something is a waste of time, the effect it can have on your confidence or on your willingness to even do anything. So the second session was very important because civil society was like, come on, you guys, like, let's get this ball rolling. There was an interesting campaign by, I think they're called Wildfire, where they were accusing countries of benefiting from the nuclear umbrella and, you know, calling them all sorts of names. And they were actually removed from the Palais des Nations because some countries complained and said that it was not diplomatic. Then finally we get to August. August is crazy because everyone was feeling good. Everyone was feeling strong. Everyone was feeling fortified. You know, we thought, you know, we're having a discussion, even if the nuclear weapon states aren't there. You know, you have countries that benefit from the nuclear umbrella who are here because they have pressure from their own national governments to do something. Well, this is where things got interesting. If you can see on my screen, I got some photos. In the top here, we have Thailand, who was in charge of the open-ended working group, working very hard. This is actually a photo from the session on the 19th of August when we got into the room after 1 week of negotiations. The negotiations are the ones that you see here. This is Ambassador Del Riggi from New Zealand. This is Paola and our colleague from Guatemala.
El Salvador.
Yeah, El Salvador, yes. And these were the sessions that we were having. So these sessions, the private sessions, civil society was kicked out. They couldn't attend. So we would basically get in there and we would have these debates or whatever, and then people would leave. And the civil society organizations were like hanging outside in the hallways. And if they saw you leaving, they're like, where are you going? And you're like, to the bathroom. They're like, okay, you have to come back and go back in there because you have to represent like the interests of non-nuclear weapon states. It was quite incredible. And on the left upper right-hand corner here, that's actually Madame Beatrice, and that's Susie Snyder, who is also a very dynamic person in the fight against nuclear weapons, abolishing nuclear weapons, and fight to abolish nuclear weapons, not to not abolish them. And that's Katie Donnelly from the New Zealand mission. And this is a picture we took at Scandal. That's where all the negotiating happens in Geneva, if you are lucky to be posted there. And basically, I just thought, you know, a picture tells 1,000 words, and it's just good to show working together is very important. And that is something that you can definitely leverage and benefit from. And also you get to meet very interesting and cool people. Now, this is, so just to give you a little bit more context, we get into the room in the Palais des Nations, ready to say, okay, we have consensus on this recommendation to the General Assembly about going forward with this treaty banning nuclear weapons. And then Australia raises their flag and says, actually, we would like to call a vote. Pandemonium, right? Because it was like, wait, we watered down so many things just to get you on board. And then you turned around and called for a vote. So we all like separated, got together in these little rooms, and then we had to go into a smaller room and see if we could get like the numbers. So that is a picture of me holding up the Zimbabwe placard. And I actually asked a colleague to take it because I said, this is the most significant contribution I'm probably ever gonna make in this field. And if you consider the fact that I'd only been in disarmament for 1.5 years at this point, that is a very sad fact to be aware of even then, to be like, oh, you know what? It's been so hard. We don't even know if this is going to happen. This is it. And we fortunately had the numbers. And basically, this is what brought us to the point where we now have a treaty, which might have 40 people by the end of today. That is just a picture of us at Scandal again. This is the Austrian representative for disarmament. That is Switzerland. That is Daniel Hoekstra from ICAN as well. And we had quite a few Latin American, Caribbean countries in the background. So just to leave you with a little bit more of a call to action, yes, we're working on the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, but let's not forget that there is a campaign to stop killer robots. Thank you.
Well, I am speechless. 3 excellent contributions, and I would like to, before opening up the floor, and I see another person that should be in, could very well be on this panel, Rihanna Krieger from CNS, who is our communication director, but has an elaborate background in this field and has worked with all of us in the past on this field. But before doing so, let me just make pick up on a few things, and I will also apologize because I'm going to also be rather controversial. All 4 of us believe in this treaty, and I would challenge anyone probably on the audience that does not believe in this treaty. But unfortunately, that is not the opinion of everyone. So I will make a few comments just to stimulate the discussion. So don't shoot the messenger, right? But first of all, I'd like to pick up on a few things that I really thought was important. Nomsa's points on, what it takes to work in the room. I think, and illustrating it with pictures, Nomsa, brilliant. And I think it's also inspiring to young diplomats from Latin America and the Caribbean to see that, someone like you were a junior diplomat for Zimbabwe, and you said, you were basically in the field for 1 year, and there you were, playing a role and sharing with heavyweights like Paola and Beatrice, in this field is very inspiring. Beatrice, you mentioned, and I'm going to give my age away here, but I mean, it feels like yesterday when I was at panel sitting with Jody Williams in 1997. Now, for those who don't know, Jody Williams is the head of the international campaign to ban landmines, and the ICBL won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for its campaign, and I'm using Beatrice's words, to push governments, all right? And so, like ICAN and other NGOs pushed governments towards this treaty, and some of them fighting and screaming, the ICBL did the same towards the anti-personnel landmine treaty. I was in Oslo for that treaty negotiations, and I can recall how ICBL blamed and shamed governments, even the government of Canada. You may recall, I don't know if Beatrice, if you were involved at that time, but there was a big banner one morning outside the hall, "Shame on you, Canada." And Canada changed its views. But I think the role of civil society in negotiations of treaties have become so important and showcased by the recent. So this to me is less about whether the treaty can be effectively verified, whether it will actually ban nuclear weapons. The symbolism of this is far more important, and I will come back to that. you also mentioned, Beatrice, the process was different when this all started, or the context was different. And I must say, I was in Vienna at the time at the CTBTO, and a dear friend and someone that I deeply respect, Ambassador Rose Gottmuller, who was, for the benefit of those who don't know, the Honorable Rose Gottmuller, she was the former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security at the US State Department, and a wonderful person. She was, we've engaged on many issues, especially CTBT, but we've known each other for a long time. And you could tell that she was really caught between two fires. You may recall that, the US did attend the meeting in Vienna, and that was her doing to do that. And she took a lot of criticism for that. And if you think about the context of the US and the UK was there too, they were trying at least to engage. That's all gone. And it was interesting, the comments made earlier by Nikolai Sokov about how things have changed. So now the kicker. I am sure that you have read with, I don't know, maybe some humor in there, but Dr. Chris Ford's article that was published in 2018, where he makes a few points, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but I do want you to also comment on this later on, because I think it's important that we don't look at the issue from a one-sided perspective. He, for instance, made the point that the treaty would neither make nuclear weapons illegal or lead to the elimination of a single weapon. That the verification of nuclear weapons, the compliance of that in the treaty is weak. He refers to that the treaty offers the disarm then join scenario, or join and then disarm, but there's no details on how this would happen. He makes the allegation that the treaty would devise and is confrontational, that would make disarmament harder. He would also say that the world, and I quote, is more dangerous and unstable place by delegitimizing the extended deterrence alliances. And he argues that since, and this is a very interesting argument, since the TPNW signatories would be required to enshrine the illegality of nuclear weapons in its own national law by taking certain legal and administrative measures, this would create a blizzard of political and legal assaults to ensure that countries could still survive. And he goes on. So, I think it's important also to echo what Nikolai said earlier, is we can all beat the drum in our own rooms, but and I'd like to hear from all three panelists eventually after other questions, is how realistic can we engage the nuclear weapon states? Or do we forget about them and simply push this because, as the ICBL established with member states of the Oslo Treaty, a norm against landmines that is very firm, is this where we're going? So with that, I am going to open the floor. And first of all, I am going to give the opportunity to Rihanna. Rihanna, are you online? Let me make sure that I can get Rihanna online. Hold on. All right. Rihanna, there you are.
Unmute.
Rihanna, hi. Would you, before you ask your very interesting question, would you just very briefly introduce yourself as well?
Sure. So I am Rihanna Tyson-Krager. I'm currently with CNS as the communications director. But before this, I first met John way back during the 2000 review process when I was at Bea's alma mater, actually, of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, heading up the Reaching Critical Will project, which is one of the founders of ICAN. So it's really great to see everybody here so much. And on that comment, I actually have something else to say about what Nomsa said, but before that, let me just thank all of you so much for this whole summer school initiative. I haven't been a part of it so far, but I've been following very closely Nomsa's awesome dynamic tweet thread on it, and so I feel like I have been here. So really, my deep gratitude to the Mexican Foreign Ministry for putting this on, and of course the efforts of Jean and Nomsa for executing it. It's just been great. So my question, and this is really directed to Beatrice and to Paola in particular, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say as well, is where do the efforts to promote the ban treaty stand now? And I'm thinking both at a civil society level and also in an intra-government advocacy level and also intergovernmental. But I'm thinking about how right now is a moment, perhaps unprecedented, as an opportunity to bring in the intersectionality of security issues to the fore. I mean, these things all make sense to us who have been supporting disarmament. We see the implications for climate and for poverty and all these other fronts. But like for instance, oh, sorry, there was echo. So our supportive governments, for instance, like tasking TPNW literacy and the promotion of it to other areas of government outside those who are in arms control departments. So departments that are talking about climate change or are trying to prevent or alleviate poverty, or efforts to examine racist structures in governance and to dismantle those systems apart. I mean, this is really a moment where we are looking, have the opportunity to look structurally at all of these governance issues. They are global in scope, they're also national, and I'm just curious to hear about that, about how we can take advantage of this intersectional moment to think creatively about expanding the circles of support for the TPNW beyond those who are already familiar with it and supportive of it, and advance it in those different areas, both within civil society and within and among governments. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rihanna. That added even more weight to the panel. We have one other question, so I'm going to ask Natalia to ask your question, and then if there are no more questions for the time being, we will go back to the panelists. And Natalia, please ask your question. Natalia from OpenAL, would you wish to ask your question?
No.
Yes, we can hear you. Natalia, go ahead, please. All right, she may have had some, so I will read the question. She is Natalia from OpenAL. Thank you for your amazing presentations. My question goes to Beatrice. What would you say to the nuclear weapon states, especially to the US and Russia, who are convinced that nuclear weapons serve as a deterrence and prevent actual war between them? Very good question. So why don't we start with Beatrice, Paola, and Nomsa, if you wish to obviously also comment on the points that Rihanna made, and well as the question by Natalia, and if you wish to do battle with me or do battle with Dr. Chris Ford, please do so.
Thank you very much. And hi, Rihanna, it's nice to see you. Yeah, I think these are really, really good questions. I wanted to start first with your comment and a little bit on the Vienna conference and the US, the change in administration. I think, from the nuclear armed states, it's one of the consequences of nuclear weapons kind of disappearing from the public sort of mindset is that it sort of narrowed the people that are talking about this weapon, and it became very limited. And this ties in a little bit to Rihanna's point as well. It was an expert community, and you know, as an kind of, when you're in these expert communities, you kind of look at people like Rose or Chris Ford and thinking that it's them that we need to convince. And that's just not how it works. And I think that, you know, what ICAN was trying to do was really to learn from the landmines and the cluster mission campaign, but also go back to the original nuclear disarmament movement that kind of were talking to the public. So we're obviously working with government, pushing diplomats to do things, but not with the purpose of, and that's what I can feel sometimes at the NPT, like the purpose is to come out with an outcome document. It's not to change anything or change opinions. It's just if we can just get this paragraph right, somehow the people in the room will feel like they've done something, but on the outside, it doesn't change much. And I think that this is part of the US government. You can have an administration like the Obama administration, who I think, you know, I think he honestly wanted to do something on nuclear weapons. I think he had a genuine interest in this issue, and, you know, started off with the Prague speech, which I think was, you know, you can criticize it a lot for not delivering, and obviously for the modernization of nuclear weapons that followed. But I think it was a pretty remarkable speech by a US president. But there's still the military interest and the structures behind it that will not allow change. And I think that that's also, you know, you can have a great person. And I really think that Rose Gottmeier is a fantastic person and can see sort of a very sort of genuine interest in also personally there. But there's too many other people and too many other structures and too many other interests there that you really have to have the public pressure. Because at the end of the day, governments are going to reflect what the public want. Not always, obviously, and there's fighting going on a lot between that. But I really do think that, you know, it's not up to these people. And in civil society, we've been kind of conditioned to thinking that we need to make friends with these individuals in governments. And if we can just make it really comfortable for them to do what we want, then something will happen. Like, that's not going to happen. I mean, even Obama couldn't make it happen. So just us like talking in a certain way to a diplomat, it's not going to change things. So we have to construct these kind of bigger movements. So, and I think that's really the point that I agree with Rihanna so much on this, that I think this is really the time. I mean, obviously we're working on entry into force and getting the treaty to formally enter into force, but now, you know, the law is only effective if people know about it and if people are actually like relating to it. And we have a lot of work to create this new norm based on this law. Getting the text right was the first step, and getting it to enter into force is the second step. And now we have to take it and make it a thing and make it something that people are aware about and things like that. And I think a lot of people are wondering like how, you know, when are we going to see 1 million people marching against nuclear weapons? And honestly, unless there's an actual use of nuclear weapons, I don't really think we're going to see that right now. And we don't want that to happen, right? So, you know, as long as it's not kind of actually happening to people. So the way that I see the public is to connect it to all these other issues that are happening. And I think that we are in such a unique moment right now, in particular because of the pandemic, where I think people are really starting to understand that me living or dying might depend on the healthcare system in a country on the other side of the world. Like, we are really, truly in this together. And my government are spending money on these weapons. And, you know, you have this kind of huge, now remarkable Black Lives Matter, anti-racist movements that are questioning sort of white supremacy policies. And looking at nuclear weapons, it's very similar. It's a very small group of people, mainly men, mainly white, privileged, not the whole countries of the 9 nuclear armed states, but the very small concentrated power in those countries that are being made powerful with these weapons and feel like they have the kind of authority to end the world if they want to. And it's actually harming people through testing and use, for example, and production as well. And it's harming people of color, it's harming indigenous communities. So the kind of this, it's a little bit like the police situation. Right? It's an institution, a structure to protect, but it's only protecting a very small, like at some certain people, and it's harming other people. So it's a very, I think that these connections, people are, you know, we have to work with that. It's also a gender issue. And this is something that Wilf and Reaching for the Will, of course, has led the work, you know, in 1915. Wilf was talking about, you know, weapons and gender. before it was trendy. And so I think that, you know, questioning like what is rationality, what is strength, what is security, we have to connect to the women's movement. We have to connect to the gender sort of equality issues. Climate change, you know, there's going to be a huge change in the way that security is. We're going to be a much more unstable world. You know, we have to connect weapons and nuclear weapons to that as well. Economic justice, we just released this report, $73 billion on nuclear weapons last year, and it's increasing. You know, and we made this calculation, how many ventilators and ICU beds and doctors and nurses you can get for that. And it's shocking. Like, we were playing around with the US numbers, like, you know, God, can we add 100,000 more doctors? Oh, okay, you know, you just kind of add more and more of these things. And that is what could protect people. So I think that really, we have to be at these places and talk about nuclear weapons, talk about the ban treaty at these venues. And I think that the humanitarian perspective is the way in to those areas. And we're working on that. I mean, we're hoping to organize events at the CSW, for example, about the gendered impact of nuclear weapons, hoping to talk about climate and climate change forums, about health concerns, reframing security, who are we protecting, what are we spending? I mean, I saw, for example, we know that governments in many ways have this kind of automated response into prioritizing weapons and military, even though all research and science says it's the opposite. More weapons leads to more death and more insecurity. Yet somehow that's rational. I mean, it's completely rational, but it's sort of we've been tricked into thinking like that. I saw, for example, in the news just last week that Australia is recognizing that climate change is going to make things really bad in the world. You know, good. And therefore, we're going to put 270 billion Australian dollars on the military to arm ourselves in this new scary world. And it's just like, you know, so even when they recognize that the threats are new, the threats are different, like the standard response is still more weapons. So I think we really have to connect with other movements to make sure that the climate change movement, when they talk about the Green New Deal, is like, pick up $35 billion from the nuclear weapons thing and put that into there. When they talk about the EU have to do this, well, look at the nuclear weapons, look at the military in general, not just nuclear weapons, but the insane military spending. So that's something I think that that's the way I think that we're going to make this issue be relevant for people again. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the concrete things on the Quiz Forward article as well. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of time now, but you know, he says all these things, it's not going to be illegal, we're not going to eliminate any nuclear weapons. It's, you know, it's not going to do anything. It's very meaningless. You know, doesn't matter. Then why is the United States and the other nuclear armed states spending so much political capital and resources and energy in stopping smaller countries from joining this treaty? I mean, to me, and this comes from WAFA, it's like a big kind of neon sign pointing weakness, vulnerability. Like, this is where it hurts them. France is furious when former French colonies are signing this treaty, and they're putting a lot of pressure. A lot of really kind of pressure on countries where they have influence to stop them. If that didn't matter, then why would they do that? They recognize that each country that signs this treaty chips away at the legitimacy. And when these weapons are delegitimized, they're going to end up with extremely expensive, unusable, shameful weapons that nobody respects. Because they are, you know, I find it a little bit difficult sometimes because I can say two different things at the same time. They are very real, these weapons. I mean, they exist, they are exercised with, they are developed, they are modernized, and they have plans to use them. I mean, we shouldn't pretend like they don't, but they're also so symbolic and so kind of like the ultimate symbol of power to go into them. And when nobody no longer respects that, they're just ginormous, expensive radioactive bombs on your own territory. If nobody's scared of your nuclear weapons, then what point do they have? So I think that they very much know the power of this treaty, and that's why they're working so hard to stop it. The thing about the verification this week is just a lie. I mean, this is something that drives me crazy because they just say it, and it is exactly like the NPT. And also the verification for elimination. I mean, obviously we could not negotiate how a nuclear armed state should verify their elimination, because it's very different if the United States with 6,000 nuclear weapons disarms versus North Korea with 2030. So that has to be up to them, because, you know, we can't. I mean, if we had more details, they would have attacked that and said that it's wrong. So basically what the treaty does is to say that when a country signs the treaty, and we have to have confidence that if a country joins the treaty banning nuclear weapons, they want to get rid of them. And I think that because it undermines and delegitimizes the weapons. So obviously, like, we have to trust the governments actually want to be a part of it then. And that will be negotiated then. That the world will be more dangerous without nuclear weapons, then why did you join the NPT? I mean, I come back to this as well, like this kind of hypocritical thinking that these weapons are really dangerous, we commit to get rid of them, nobody else can have them because they're dangerous, and more will be dangerous, but also they're really important and ensure our security, but we're going to get rid of them, but they're really important. It doesn't make any sense. You have to choose, are they good weapons or bad weapons? Do they protect? If they do protect, then why work on, why have New START? Why have all these things? Why sign the NPT? Then everyone have them. If they create peace, then why are you against proliferation? You have to kind of choose in this argument. So obviously the United States recognized that nuclear weapons are bad, otherwise they wouldn't have joined the NPT, committing to get rid of them someday. And I mean, to be honest, I mean, we're doing them a favor in a way by rallying all these governments to make a legally binding commitment to never under any circumstances develop nuclear weapons. That's good news, even if they don't join it. So I think that they should be grateful.
Thank you, Beatrice. Before other panelists, let me just say that we are, in terms of the program, out of time. But I am asking the 71 participants that are online, including the 5 of us, to please stay online, because I certainly have the time. I hope the panelists would have the time, because this is a really interesting and important discussion. So with that, who wish to comment next? Paola or Nomsa?
Fine. Yeah, so I'll comment first on the question of Brianna. One thing about the efforts from the state side, let's say that way, of course, we are focusing our efforts more in achieving the entry into force of the treaty. That will be now the main objective. I have to be honest, we are only at this point targeting and approaching those countries we already voted in favor of the adoption of the treaty, because in that way it's the easiest way now to get to the 50, which will actually give us the entry into force. So it's more about being also effective now and for that main objective. By saying so, that doesn't mean that we do not care about others joining or the universalization of the treaty itself, which is actually one of the provisions of the treaty. Now, taking this point and some of the comments that Beatrice made, and as I mentioned in my presentation, first of all, this treaty is not an end in itself and was never said as that. We said this might have a contribution, but this is just the beginning, and we have to complement the regime with other treaties and other instruments that might contribute toward the final end. By saying this also, I will just comment on some of the aspects also from the open-ended working group in 2016 and the actual negotiation of the treaty, which I did not have the time to do in my presentation. After 2015, when we realized that, of course, these countries will not, we're not willing to have any movement towards global zero, we actually wanted to open the floor, let's say that way. Let's give the space to countries to give their perspectives and to come and say in which way we can do so. And that's how the 2016 open-ended working group was actually established. That was the purpose of it. In this open-ended working group, we had everyone but the nuclear weapon states. And this is really important because the umbrella countries were actually there still. So we have them all in 2013 in the first open-ended working group, plus we also have countries. China went there once just to see what happened, but did not actually join for the whole negotiation. But during the whole open-ended working group in 2013, nuclear armed states such as India and Pakistan stayed there the whole time. And that was something that we have to also see these memberships, because in 2016, none of the 9 armed states participated. They all were invited. It was an open-ended working group from the UN. They were invited. It was discussions, not negotiations. So they, in a way, closed this door. They were like, no, there's no, they were not even willing to discuss in which way we can progress. And that's how we achieved 2 recommendations on the open-ended working group with umbrella countries in the room. The first one is pretty broad, you can read it there, but the second one was actually calling for this United Nations conference to negotiate a treaty banning, prohibiting the nuclear weapons with legally binding instruments. So the important part also of this is that it was always open for umbrella countries and nuclear armed states to participate there. Also, of course, in the conferences, because the conference of 2017 was a UN conference. Any country member of the UN was invited. It was their decision not to be there. Despite that, while we were negotiating the treaty, we were always considering the need to leave the space for those countries, if they change their mind at some point, to join it. So the treaty itself and all these and all the efforts towards it, at any point, it was something against them or against their positions. It was something in favor of humanity and in favor of getting rid of these weapons. So that's something that we have to be really clear about also in this point of if we are interested or not bringing them on board. Of course we are, but we also know where they are standing. But despite that, the door is open. And of course, Article 4 of the treaty actually explains exactly the procedure in which they can come on board and leave the door open for creating new verification mechanism in case it's needed. And of course, to create them ad hoc, I mean, considering the profile of the country. So, I mean, those kind of arguments against verification or not are quite weak. And we have to say, I mean, to actually highlight that most of the criticisms are really weak. And I mean, from our side also, the thing that we have done is engaging with them when we have a fora, I mean, for both sides, nuclear weapon states and countries under nuclear deterrence doctrine. Every time they make any kind of criticism towards treaty, we say, okay, if you want, we can have a discussion on that. But actually there's one thing, either your argument is too weak or it's a bad interpretation of the treaty, which is actually, let's say, going around Article 18 of the treaty, which if they say, no, this is against the NPT and everything, is like, okay, your interpretation has nothing to do with anyone in the room negotiating the treaty. And I mean, and actually we can have a long argument and a long discussion around this kind of criticism. One by one, they are really weak. For that, sorry, I will make an announcement. There are some documents that the ICRC actually developed on some of the provisions of the treaty, which are public in the ICRC webpage. Just go and look for them, because they touch upon actually a lot of these arguments, a lot of which are the safeguards provision of the treaty, and explain exactly why these provisions are totally in line with existing international law, and actually the contribution of these provisions. So I think with that we'll go. I mean, I touched some of the points that Chris Ford made in his in his article, and there's something there about security that we have to touch upon again. Every time they come and say, look, this is, we need conditions, and you know, they are not, now the current situation conditions are not good for nuclear disarmament, and they are not conducive to that. There's something that, I mean, they have never been able to reply, and is, we have embarked in this point because the use of nuclear weapons is not acceptable under any circumstance. Any circumstance means not today, not tomorrow, not with these circumstances, not even if they changes, even if they get worse, they are not acceptable. So what's the point of trying to point some conditions, even conditions linked to solving the Middle East, you know, like conflict now, and because they have done that, they have listed some of the conditions, and it's including one of them is actually solving the whole Middle East region conflicts. It's like, really? I mean, are you actually asking for this list of conditions for you to get rid? Do not forget that for you, this is not, and I'm talking about 5 of them, not 9, but 5 of them, it's an obligation. It is not if you want it or not. You sign up for this. And actually that's part of the NPT. I mean, the Great Bargain is part of that. I mean, you will disarm, no proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear weapons, we are gonna grant them. So if you don't, if after 50 years you keep saying, you know, it's not the time and that's gonna take a long time, it's kind of a bad joke. You know, most of it because it has not started. They might say they have made contributions, yes. Some general contributions, yes, but not nuclear disarmament, not even reductions. The reductions that they have at this point done, they are contributions, yes. Why they are not nuclear disarmament? I mean, there's no international verification. How do we know that it actually happened? There's some verification between the parties, yes, but the rest, we haven't seen it, yes or no? So it's out of a good faith. The other point, and I think it's the most important one, are they irreversible or not? So I mean, to have any kind of steps actually that are contributing to nuclear disarmament, those must be transparent, verifiable, irreversible. Just tell me which of the measures that are taken until now have the 3 elements, these 3 principles that we all agree that nuclear disarmament must have. So I think I will leave it there, but just to have these elements every time that we listen an argument about why we must keep nuclear weapons and if the contributions are not, because they always say we are contributing so much, if their contributions actually are or not a nuclear disarmament measure or only a contribution. So I will leave it there to Nomsa to have some time.
Thank you, Paola. I know, Nomsa, you want to make some comments, and I believe Rihanna would like to add something as well. So Nomsa, go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Basically, I had the great fortune of reading a book by A.C. Temperley that was written in 1938. And then I think he published it in 39, just after Germany under Hitler had walked into Czechoslovakia and the League of Nations experiment had been completely declared dead. And it's very interesting to me that in that book, written so many years ago, before even the first nuclear weapon detonation, on the topic of disarmament was the notion that verification needs to be, you know, the underpinning. And if we don't have it, then what's the point? Well, if we look at basic contract law, right? If you agree to do something, there is supposed to be a good faith interpretation. So when you have nuclear weapon states making arguments to say, oh, well, the treaty doesn't have this, or, well, this is just ridiculous pie in the sky, to me, that argument doesn't hold any water, because just like all these other treaties that we had Dr. Sokov talking about Russian and American cooperation in the last 60 years, right? They're all falling apart. So even this notion of saying, oh, well, what good does it do? Those were mostly bilateral agreements that we all welcomed and we all felt were very helpful towards maintaining international peace and security. So I think there's room for a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, whether or not the United States chooses to join. I think there's room to have people, once again, just like we have nuclear weapons free zones, say, we are committing to doing this. And then you can continue and stand there in your wrongness and do whatever it is that you're doing, which is ridiculous. That's my first point. And then my second point is, if we look at SSOD1, which was the first session in 1978 for disarmament, one of the things that was said in that document was, and I'm going to actually read it, although the decisive factor for achieving real measures of disarmament is the political will of states, especially of those possessing nuclear weapons, a significant role can also be played by the effective functioning of an appropriate international machinery designed to deal with the problems of disarmament in its various aspects. I think that's what we're doing. So to Chris Ford, I would probably say maybe, reread that document, which your country endorsed in 1978. And then, let's talk about the fact that we now have a situation where a nuclear weapon state feels like they can just arbitrarily pull out of agreements, then what is the point of anything? Why should we even listen to what you have to say? Because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You're not acting in good faith. You're not upholding your side of the collective or the great bargain. So why should your argument hold water over the argument of over 130 states who are saying, you know what, we don't want this? And I think my last point would just be regarding the status quo. John Stewart was in an interview a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about the issues about racial discrimination in the United States and around the world and white supremacy. But this is also very relevant to what we're dealing with in terms of nuclear weapons. And he said, the status quo is not going to change itself because it benefits from maintaining that system. So any change, you cannot look to those same people and expect them to change what is happening. Other people have to make it happen. And then it dismantles the system. But if you're going to look at them and say, please, someday, sir, can you, it's just not going to happen. Why would it? I've heard people raise the argument that, oh, this is $1 billion industry in the US, the UK, and France, et cetera. Why would all those people basically negotiate themselves out of jobs, out of contracts, out of anything? So when we talk about prohibiting nuclear weapons and we talk about who needs to be in the room and whose opinion matters, I actually think the opinion of nuclear weapon possessor states matters the least. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Nomsa. Rihanna, would you like to add something quickly before we ask two more questions?
I'm just going to take advantage of the opportunity of speaking to a large group of diplomats here, especially younger ones who are newer to the field, and especially arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation. When we're talking about the role of civil society, I will take issue with something that Nomsa said earlier on about how 5-6 years ago, the involvement of civil society just wasn't there. Girl, it was. Like, so, there I can go on for a long time about how active we were and how that activity had actually increased both in volume and in efficacy, all leading toward, the birth of ICAN and everything later on. But the point here to smaller delegations in particular, you're tasked with all these different portfolios. Civil society is the resource that you should welcome the most, because most of the time they are really expert on the issues. They can not only help expedite your education on the issues itself, but on the institutional memory of how things have gone and maybe, some advice on how to do this. Also, they can provide some consultations based on their expertise and their institutional memory about how you as a smaller delegation can be more effective in the work that you do with these things. And so even though for me as an American, especially when I was doing this work, under the Bush administration, like Nomsa said, it was, and Beatrice as well, talking to my own representatives was, banging my head against the wall. But I found the most effective use of my time was dealing with allied governments allied in terms of the cause that I was trying to advance, in helping them, because they did have voices in the room, platforms, and like it had been noted, we weren't allowed in the room most of the time. The consultations that I did with them, they would come to me with small questions, things that they thought were silly or dumb or whatever, to larger, more strategic negotiating advice. And so they're there to help, and don't hesitate to reach out to them and rely on them if you feel you need a bolster in that area.
Sorry, Rihanna, I meant in the conference on disarmament, not in the, because we have like the landmine ban and we have all those other treaties that have been negotiated out of the CD because of how static that council chamber is. I think I have PTSD when I think of that room, personally.
Jan, you're muted.
Let me not get started on the conference on disarmament. I do recall the resolution that Paola was referred to earlier, and I so wished that resolution was tabled, because I think the days of the conference on disarmament are actually numbered. It has become an irrelevant body. But I wanted to pick up, before asking our two more questions here on 2 points quickly. The one that Beatrice made about the tendency to describe success in the context of the NPT in terms of carefully crafted language and paragraphs. And, you know, and here I will sort of say to the audience, you know, this is a situation where you should do as I say and not do as I do, because I have become quite disillusioned with the NPT. As you may, some of you may know, I at one point in my life ate and breathed and everything NPT, and I find that the NPT has become exactly that, what Beatrice is saying, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the TPNW is an alternative to the NPT, because the two treaties are complementary, as it is very clearly in the preamble of the TPNW and articles of the TPNW. But I do recall, and this is, you know, coming back to civil society or just being human beings, after spending, I think, Rihanna, you'll remember, was it 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever in the UN building at the end of the 2000 conference. That Saturday evening, drove home, came home, and my wife asked, so what happened? I said, well, we did it. You know, and you know, South Africa and the New Agenda Coalition played a major role in the successful outcome of that conference. And we have a document and so on and so on. And, you know, I had the original draft there with me, and she said, did you agree to abolish nuclear weapons? Did you agree? And those days it was still the early time of North Korea's brinkmanship and Iran. And did you agree to do any of this? You know, no, 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 no. But look at the text. She read it and she said, and she's, you know, she's an editor herself, and she said, this is not even English. It doesn't make sense. And so, you know, I think if we talk about, this is where the civil society thing comes into. I mean, you know, if you walk outside and you talk to people on the street about the NPT and about this and so on, and their eyes will glaze over. If you talk about, oh, well, this is a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Oh, okay, tell me more. You know, this is my concern with treaties of the FMCT, and even the treaty that I've been working for probably half my professional life for, on the CTBT. Banning nuclear tests, what are those? Well, I mean, you know, but everyone knows that, you know, what a nuclear weapon is. And that brings me to the point about the role of civil society. You know, and I'm not saying this because we are civil society, a CNS, and we have prominent speakers on the line in that field. But I do think, especially for our diplomats, that you have to bear in mind that civil society are your friends. And I will just mention one incident that is really dear to me, and I will refer to a friend that we all know very well. In 1995, when we debated the NPT indefinite extension, and when we came up with all sorts of package deals, including the now infamous nuclear non-proliferation program of action in the principles and objectives. We as South Africa and other countries were severely criticized, both within the non-aligned, but also by the weapon states. And Dr. Rebecca Johnson was out there with disarmament diplomacy and writing little articles, very much what was done, Rihanna, what you guys did in 2000. And Rebecca was obviously, you know, part of that too. And that it created a movement outside the room that allows us to operate. And it gave us some credibility, because we were being discredited both by our allies in the non-aligned, because we were supporting indefinite extension, but definitely by the weapon states, including in capital. And so the role of civil society is not just this pushing, but it creates the space for governments to work in. So I think that's really important. Okay, with that, I'm going to ask Gonzalo to ask his question, and then also will ask William and Aldo. So Gonzalo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is from Ms. Fihn. I think she actually has already answered at some point, but I'd appreciate if she can elaborate a bit more. Seeing the current situation of the CTBT, which does not have the support of the nuclear weapon states, and thus its entry into force is unlikely, what is the reaction you might expect from nuclear weapon states when the TPNW enters into force, taking in mind that it is supported by all of the non-nuclear weapon states?
Thank you, Gonzalo. How about, I think Aldo has a problem with his microphone. Aldo, can you come online? Doesn't look like it. So, yes, Aldo? So Aldo's question, and he was very complimentary of the presentations. He said the well-appreciated influence of civil society in this field, particularly when it comes to move forward the humanitarian dimension in the context of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, seems to depend on how responsive civil society is to the governments of negotiating states. Are there strategies in place from civil society standpoint to push forward their agenda in those states that are non-responsive to civil society or the voice of the people? Very good question. Then I have William. William, do you wish to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jean Preez, for your help. This question is going to Mrs. Paola Valenzuela, because as he was talking about, said that she's fighting for non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation in the world. But at the end of her speech, she has said that they can use the nuclear energy for better use. So is there any conflict between non-proliferation nuclear in the world and use it in a better way? There's not a conflict about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. No, actually, the deal is that, I mean, in the NPT, the deal is you have the 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized. I mean, it's supposed that they will disarm under the condition that, of course, no one else will proliferate. No of the other members will seek to have nuclear weapons, but the peaceful uses of nuclear energy are granted for everyone. So peaceful uses of nuclear energy, that one, everyone can use them. So it's just about the military use against the peaceful uses. So the one that we do not agree with is, of course, the military use of it. But the peaceful uses can, as we have seen when we have other classes related to the IEA, how it can actually contribute to many aspects, medicine and other development aspects. So the peaceful uses is not in conflict at any point with disarmament, just to clarify that. Thank you.
Can I go on? Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, you know, both the question about the CTBT not being entered into force and also the challenges in the NPT and the sort of frustration and struggle, you know, I sometimes get the feeling that we're a bit too harsh on treaties, that, you know, we are so stuck in it not being 100% perfect that we forget also how much they have achieved and what a success they have. And of course, you know, we can be very disappointed with the NPT for not leading to nuclear disarmament, but sometimes I still feel like, you know, there is a bargain there, there was a commitment, but the clue is kind of in the name, a non-proliferation treaty. That was really the main, you know, yes, it was a bargain, but the NPT has done its job on the proliferation side, or preventing proliferation in quite a successful way. It's not flawless, of course. We have 4 countries that are outside it that have nuclear weapons. But when you compare it to the 60s, when they thought that, you know, within 10, 15 years, there will be 30 nuclear armed states, like, it's done a really remarkable job. And the same thing with the CTBT, even if it hasn't entered into force, the CTBT is doing really well. you know, we've had one country that has kind of broken the norm that the CTBT has set of banning nuclear tests. And that's a really successful thing. I mean, sometimes I feel, you know, we're looking at the, you know, weapons so black and white. Like it's never that you would look at the Universal Human Rights Declaration and say, ah, there was a human rights violation. It was all for nothing. We should never have done this. You know, it's work in progress, and it's a part of a process. You know, laws, international law, domestic law, it does not mean that it never happens. It means that it sets the norm of what's okay and what's not okay. And it helps us relate to it, and it helps us shift our behavior as much as possible. So I do think that we have to, you know, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit of an intentional thing to always say that the NPT is in crisis. Because if you threaten that the NPT might be like taken away from us, you're not going to push it, right, with the nuclear armed states. So I feel like the nuclear armed states have an interest in threatening that the NPT is in crisis, because it will mean that the non-nuclear weapon states won't demand more and won't be so tough. Like, you should be grateful for this little outcome document, this little crumbs that we're giving you. And it's part of that kind of prospect. And one of the things, and where I really appreciate Rihanna's comments about as diplomats working closely with civil society, is that, you know, we recognize that diplomats move a lot, and they change portfolios, they change venues. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Geneva. I've seen a lot of diplomats coming in like, okay, great, conference on disarmament. What are we going to do? Are we going to get a program of work? And you're like, no, like, sorry, no. And they're like, but what about, no, like, don't even, you know. And I think that seeing the way that the nuclear weapon states behave in the NPT over a series of review conference, you see the pattern, and you see the kind of dangling a little agreement that, you know, gets watered down, but it feels like a victory and everyone's really happy, and then they do the opposite, and then, well, now you're going to have to jump even higher next time. And it's a bit of an abusive relationship. I've heard people describe it as being in an abusive relationship between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear weapon states at the NPT. But I don't see that the TPNW is in any way replacing that, but it's just a different treaty, right? And it has a different purpose, and it will set this kind of norm. I'm very much expecting the nuclear weapon states to be very critical when the treaty enters into force. And I very much already hear them, you're losing momentum. Nobody supports this treaty. It's not going as fast as you thought it would go. It's just kind of manipulating and trying to kind of dissuade people from supporting it. You know, I can probably craft the tweets from the US State Departments or comments from France or the UK when it enters into force, like, oh, look, nothing happened. It was a waste of time. I mean, that's exactly what they're going to say. Don't believe it. Like, it is having an impact. It's going to make it. So they're going to be very critical. And the comment about civil society and how to work with, or how to impact in non-democratic countries. You know, obviously, the way civil society is treated, you know, we shouldn't be shy about admitting that, you know, governments work with us when it's in their interest in many ways. And I think that we see that as civil society, and particularly when we look at this kind of intersectionality that also Rihanna talked about before. You know, we talk about gender, we talk about climate. Suddenly the governments that are really good friends and allies in the nuclear weapons field are suddenly, when it comes to gender issues, not so keen on working with us, or human rights issues, or these other things, or economic justice issues. And that goes for both democratic and non-democratic countries. I mean, obviously we have more formal processes in democratic countries, but there's a reason why, you know, even a country like my country, Sweden, like, is very friendly when it comes to feminist foreign policy and very inclusive of women, but they're not going to talk to me so much when it comes to TPNW anymore. You know, don't invite me to that meeting. And, you know, even a country like that, right? It's complex, and because it's difficult and it's annoying. And when civil society is criticizing you know, it's even how democratic they are. But I do think that we have ways of working in non-democratic countries. We get a lot of criticism for only focusing on, say, UK, US, France, and not so much on Russia and China. We do focus on those countries as well, and we do work. It's just not so much, you know, fighting with diplomats on Twitter, because that's not how you work in Russia or China, or campaigners there, or people that we have, you know, work with in those countries. They just behave in a different way. They can't be so confrontational with their government. So it's much more academia. It's much more like, different ways of, they can't be so confrontational the way that I could be with my government, for example. But then also, I think that this isn't just civil society impacting governments. This is also governments change their minds because of other governments. And I think that here is also where, that's why this treaty is so important, and that's why every single government has a role to play, because you are peers with those diplomats in a way that civil society isn't. And some foreign ministers do not care what civil society say, even if they are free to speak. But when another foreign minister from their neighboring country says it, then it starts to kind of sink in. So we also work with, we see how the Landmines Treaty, how the cluster munitions has also impacted countries without active civil society. It shifts norms, it sort of changes behavior. We've seen Russia hiding the fact that they have cluster munitions on airplanes and remove footage of that. They haven't signed the treaty, but they do it because they know it's a, you know, they know that Human Rights Watch are going to come and like nag them about it. So it kind of works away, not always straightforward, but we have ways of doing that. And I think that that is where we can be working together very much, that, you know, we can be the public things, but the governments can also do the job of pushing these governments in bilateral conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other responses from the panel? Okay.
Actually, I did want to say,
go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, especially if you're a small country, find out who the civil society people are in whatever field you're going into when you're on a diplomatic post, because they will have the institutional memory that sometimes the smaller foreign ministries don't have. So they're an incredible resource. And they're also very good at connecting you with other diplomats who are like-minded or who can help you with whatever initiative you're looking for. That's one thing I was gonna say.
Thank you. Paola, there was a question to you. Do you want to talk about the use? There was a question from William.
I think I never replied to that.
Oh, you didn't reply to it. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, let me wrap up by thanking our distinguished panel, and also for Rihanna for joining as a ad hoc panelist. That was really exciting to see you on the panel as well. And also thank you to all the participants for asking questions. And this would then conclude our day today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we will talk about nuclear security and nuclear terrorism, another very dangerous thing that we have to live for. And then tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow, the second session, just to forewarn our participants, we will have breakout groups. We will set up the breakout groups in Zoom, in the Zoom discussion forum. And you will have opportunities to discuss amongst yourselves what you consider to be the biggest threats in the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament fields, and what you think should be done about it. And then we will come back Friday morning with feedback from you. So this is the time for you to engage and let us know how these things should be dealt with. So with that, I will close today's session by thanking everyone again.